Hello everybody. I have feedback for you all based on all of your submissions. I've basically taken screenshots of all of your submissions and I've tried to remove names, but just a heads up, like some of your papers end up showing up more than others simply because there were good examples and easy ones to talk about. In general though, everybody's paper had a lot of feedback and a lot of room for improvement, and the reason I'm including these is not to pick on any individual group, but to give examples that I think apply to most groups. So don't feel singled out. I'm trying to help you guys become better writers by giving examples of things we can all improve. And I should note that I did this last year too, and last year's feedback video is also on Moodle, so you're welcome to look at that and this one. In fact, I encourage you to look at that one because there's some feedback in that one that I did not include in this video. When I first look at your introductions, I really just look at your topic sentences and try to understand the narrative you're trying to tell me. And that tells me, well, first, whether or not you're telling a good story, and second, it helps me try to figure out ways you can improve that storytelling. So be sure to look at the feedback I give you on your introduction structure if you did get some feedback like that. In general, you should be developing that narrative. One thing that I sometimes see, especially in introductions, but also discussions, is unnecessarily broad details. So I wanted to point this out as an example of something that I think is probably broader than the scope of what you're trying to write. Take a look here. Stream ecology is a term that is used to define the interactions between organisms and their environment within a stream. Stream ecology can show us a wide variety of aspects of ecology in one atmosphere. Notice this is kind of not all that pointed. It's not really in a detailed manner telling us about your specific study. It's just talking about a field at large, and I would probably just exclude this whole paragraph. Another thing that doesn't contribute to your narrative is if you are using any words that you can omit. Sometimes these are just like a few words that maybe detract from how straightforward your paper is. Sometimes it's going to be whole sentences, or like we just saw, even whole paragraphs. So let me show you some examples. Note that. If I remove note that and just say identification of the macroinvertebrates occurred in a regulated laboratory setting, these two words can be fully removed and meaning doesn't change. That's the litmus test. If you can remove something and the meaning doesn't change, then you can probably just remove it. Same here. As seen in the figure to the left, you could just cite Fig 1. The specific part we are looking at is near the connection to Honey Creek and was shallow enough to wade throughout. Depth isn't really going to change the meaning of this paragraph or the interpretation of your results, and therefore this is probably unnecessary. You could omit that. Here we have an example from the results. Each of these species are different and have different characteristics. That sentence doesn't tell me a lot, so really be critical of your own writing and ask yourself, is this sentence necessary? Related to this is what I like to call off-the-cuff writing, or you might call this like BSing, or that stands for below standard writing. Basically, if you are writing just to get words on the page, it's really obvious and it doesn't make for a good product, and put in that work to actually write something meaningful. So let me show you an example. In one stream, many aspects can be studied. Individually speaking, we can study genetics, habitats, behavior, and more. Now, I appreciate that you're trying to write an introduction to this paper, but in general, this is not really telling me a lot about the system at hand. So I want you to get out of the habit of writing off the cuff and actually give lots of thought to each of your sentences. Make sure every sentence tells me something. One final thing that I noticed in many of your introductions is some of you had spelling mistakes here with Menominee, and you might think that's not a huge deal. It's actually a different river. There is a Menominee River in like the upper peninsula of Michigan and northern Wisconsin. And Honey Creek, not the Honey Creek River, but Honey Creek is also a different creek in western Wisconsin. There are two Honey Creeks. So as you're doing your research, make sure you're actually looking at the right ones. Both of ours are pretty local here, and if you're seeing anything about being a tributary of the Wisconsin River or anything about being longer than, I think it's like 40 miles long, or something in northern Wisconsin, those are the wrong river and creek. Make sure you have the right river and creek. One of the biggest lacks in most of your papers were in-text citations. You need to cite your work. Anything that you include that doesn't come from your own brain, that is, it's somebody else's idea, or something that isn't going to be common knowledge needs to be cited. So let me give you an example. Phosphorus is a nutrient that helps with plant growth. This is probably something that should be cited. Maybe that's common knowledge, but you probably found that in a different source, and therefore this should be cited. There is a higher chance that phosphorus can run into the water, which can increase fish death. This definitely needs to be cited. If you're claiming that phosphorus increases fish death, this needs to be cited. My suspicion is that maybe this was written off the cuff or found in a non-academic source. So if you think you found it in a non-academic source, you would then need to go in and find evidence of this in an academic source, ideally something peer-reviewed and primary, and then you could cite that. And if you can't find it in an academic or reputable source, then don't include it. Another example, a biodiverse waterway would house a large variety of organisms and can maintain itself without constant human intervention. The fact that biodiverse waterways would be more resilient to change despite a lack of human intervention, that kind of needs citation. You should be looking into the conservation literature for evidence of that. You'll all be citing either Hilsenhoff's or Lyons in your methods because you're using their methods. And so many of you will say something like, we performed our experiments, or we measured our index of biotic integrity based on the methods of Hilsenhoff. And then you would cite it with a number in brackets. Now, it might seem like I'm being picky about what you need to cite, but to be clear, you need to cite things, and this is going to be a skill that you'll use the rest of your college career and academic career if you ever end up doing writing like this. So get used to citing things and using those citations as evidence of your credibility. Use other people's hard work to give credibility to your own writing. One more note about citing Lyons and Hilsenhoff. When you cite an established protocol, you can sometimes get away with not including all of the details of that protocol as long as you correctly cite that protocol and mention that it's not fully detailed. So I give an example of how this can be done and how it's often done in that other video. I encourage you to check out that other video. It'll save you some work. Speaking of citations, you should be looking at the format that you're required to use based on PLOS Biology's style guide. This is a great use of a citation, but it's not the required format. Your style guide says that your citations should be numbered sequentially and in brackets and before the period. If you put it in the middle of a sentence, that can be okay, depending on the situation. But If it's at the end, it comes before a period. And while we're talking about citations and formatting, you should also be very careful to format your references, your citations in your references lists appropriately. Note that I said references list. You need a references list. You may have heard this called a literature cited list and a works cited list. Those are mostly the same thing, but according to your style guide, the PLOS Biology style guide, you are going to have a references list. Notice here that this is an example of an article. All of PLOS's articles are free. They don't have paywalls, they are open access, and you can see how people have formatted their references. If you're not fully sure of how to format your references, go to the style guide, check out references, and come back here. So you've got last name, you've got initials without periods, you've got commas separating them, you've got maximum of 6 followed by et al. If there are more than 6, you've got abbreviated journal names with a period at the end but not at the intermediate words. You've got a semicolon, a colon, a space. There are a lot of ticky-tacky rules here, but you should be following them as well as you're able, using this as a guide, and then if this doesn't answer any questions, go back to those example articles that you can find for free without paywalls on the PLOS Biology website, and you can then use them as examples to follow. And while we're talking about formatting, let's look at figures and tables. So there will be some guidelines in the style guide for these as well. Because that style guide is designed for people that are submitting their papers to a journal, some of those requirements may not be entirely applicable to you guys, specifically the ones that might say to separate your figure caption from your figures. I would like you guys to include your figure captions directly underneath your figures. In general, figure captions go underneath figures and table captions go above tables. Take a look here. You've got a very brief summary of the figure followed by any more details that are required. If you've got a figure that has more details that need to be explained, you can just explain them here, but my hunch is that many of your figures will not require too much for explanation. Notice here it's Fig 1 period, so follow that formatting. This table in the PDF version has its caption over the table. That's how I would like you to do it. In some versions online, you actually see the table caption below, but please put your table captions above the table. Note you've got a bolded header with non-bolded bulk of the table, and in my opinion, I like tables that don't have lines in them, but I see this one has some lines in it, and I'm not going to be picky about that for this assignment. So this I thought was a really well formatted table. The table caption is above. The width of it is the same width as the page was. I might have bolded these. I might have centered everything in the boxes just to make it look nice, but in general, this was a pretty well formatted table. I might have omitted the words depicts the and just gone with number of each macroinvertebrate found. When you cite figures and tables in your text, notice that for the most part, whenever something is cited in the text, it's cited very much like a reference would be, where you just, well, I guess they don't use brackets, but you're not actually saying as seen in figure 1 or as you can see in figure 1, or figure 1 shows that. Notice how they're just saying a fact and then providing the figure that backs it up. The cooperation rate increased quickly, fig 1. Their ages ranged from 6 to 55 with 4 males and 5 females. S1 table, that's supplementary, you don't need to know about that. But in general, avoid saying things like, as seen in figure 1. In your methods, you should always be using past tense. I saw a lot of future and some present tense. Always use the past tense. That is future tense right there, which is why I commented on it. In your methods, you should be using prose. Avoid numbered lists or like bulleted points for protocols. You should be using prose. Also, take a look here. That is the imperial system. Down with the Brits. We want the metric. This is a continuation from that previous slide. Note that there is no analysis method listed. In your methods section, you should describe how your data are analyzed. And notice we're not going to be using those numbered lists in our protocols, but you should have maybe the last paragraph that discusses how your data were analyzed. Your analysis is going to primarily be your calculation of your index of biotic integrity. And as I mentioned in that other video, you can say something like, we calculated our index of biotic integrity as in Hilsenhoff, and then you would cite Hilsenhoff. And then you could say briefly, we calculated the average tolerance value of each of the macroinvertebrates we collected, or something like that. All right, getting into a little bit more formatting, notice that genus and species names are always formatted in the same way in science. I tested you on this actually, and what I want you to remember is that they're always italicized. When you've got the Linnaean names, the genus and species names, they're always italicized. And at the first mention, you always use the full name. So in this case, E. coli is actually the genus and species name. And so it should be Escherichia coli. And then at subsequent mentions, you can then abbreviate that long first genus name to that first initial, where we would say E. coli. Notice that this C is still small, and that's going to be tough because Microsoft Word is going to try to automatically change this to capitalized because it sees a period here. But Microsoft Word is wrong, and you need to fix it. Notice that this abbreviated genus name comes after the first mention unless that begins a sentence. So if this person had simply said E. coli is not harmful, they would actually have to write out the whole genus. Here we have it again. Always use your metric system. Miles is the imperial system. So this would be something like, I don't know, 55-ish kilometers. Here we see the metric. You should, though, be abbreviating those metric units. And when you do, you should always be putting a space between the number and the unit. Your results were maybe the least fleshed out for some groups, and it's not clear to me if this was just not communicated to you well or if you didn't put in the time and work to actually calculate your IBIs. But I want to be clear, you need to calculate your IBI, and that needs to be included in your results. This group, I thought, did a good job of showing us the individual metrics that contributed to their IBI, as well as the total IBI that came later in the prose of their results. So your results should begin with some prose, some like sentences. You can discuss or you can mention anything objective that you found. So you can summarize your data. You can mention observations if you think they're important. And then anything in your results should be discussed in your discussion. Your results will include this IBI. You may include a table if you think it communicates what you're trying to say well, but ultimately you will end up discussing every component of your results in your discussion.